This country, in the Bill of Rights, gives every individual the right of belief, that he may believe according to the dictates of his own conscience, that there will be no state religion and no foundings in religion, but that the faiths of different peoples shall be respected. In practical application, this means that it is unwise and usually unprofitable to attempt any critical comparison between religious groups. We get considerable mail dealing on this subject, in which we are asked to say which of a certain number of groups is the best and most authentic. The conditions of our way of life simply make it impossible for us to answer such questions in a manner that is fair and proper. Also, we must recognize that the terms commonly used in religion are subject to numerous interpretations by different groups, and therefore ideas which upon the surface may seem strange and different may upon analysis reveal considerable parallelism. The reverse may be also true, and ideas which seem much alike in popular presentation may be essentially very different. So those questions which must force us to take sides or to attempt to interpret the beliefs of another creed now functioning and capable of interpreting itself, we must decline. Otherwise, we will certainly soon be in the midst of a controversy. And controversies in religion are not purposeful. We have really no dogmatic position upon which we can judge the right of another person to believe that which he regards to be proper and respectable. So some questions we may have to sidestep on these grounds, but we will do the best we can and point out such principles as seem valuable to us. Here we have a question I have not been able to understand, either philosophically or religiously, the important differences between the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics. In my mind, they seem to be very similar, yet there must be some distinguishing point of belief in each. This is a good question because it has been brought up by many rather learned writers who have been unable to clearly differentiate between these two groups. Neoplatonism, as it rose and developed in Alexandria, was essentially a revival of Platonic philosophy. The sect, however, went further into mysticism than can be reconstructed from the surviving writings of Plato. This mysticism, however, is a reasonable extension of Platonic thought, and I think we should define Neoplatonism, therefore, as a mystical Platonism, a mystical philosophy, advancing its principles largely by philosophic method, that is, by appealing to the rational faculties through logic, through reason, and through various analogies, by means of which the basic teachings of Platonic philosophy could be brought to bear upon moral and ethical questions. Gnosticism was a two-pronged cult, one part rising in Syria under Simon Magus, and the other rising in Egypt under Basilides and Valentinus. Essentially, Gnosticism is a religion rather than a philosophy. Gnosticism was a religious belief derived primarily from pre-existing religious beliefs in the area, especially Egyptian religion and the religions of Asia. Gnosticism, however, early became involved in Christian mystical thinking. Therefore, in substance, Gnosticism was a magical, devotional faith, using philosophy rather sparingly, but going almost immediately into an abstract realm of metaphysical speculation. For example, Gnosticism was messianic. It believed in the basic intercession of divine powers, called aeons or archons, and that these powers could be primarily supplicated by prayer, by magic rites, by symbols and talismanic means, and that therefore religion was a divine magic. This is contrary to the Neoplatonists, who believed that philosophy, or a divine mystical philosophy, was still essentially a problem in self-discipline and the development of personal faculties and powers. Thus, Gnosticism believed more in the religious ideas of grace, forgiveness of sin, and things of this kind, whereas Neoplatonism was more formal in its demand upon the character of the individual. Thus, we could summarize and say that Neoplatonism taught philosophically that a man must outgrow his sins, whereas Gnosticism believed that a man must repent his sins, and by repentance invoke the powers of grace in the universe. Thus, Gnosticism was a theological structure, whereas Neoplatonism was essentially a philosophical structure. Both of these groups, however, became deeply involved later in their consequences and affected the rise of early and medieval Christianity to a considerable degree. Neoplatonism helping to strengthen the philosophic side of Christianity, and Gnosticism helping to strengthen the belief in the reality of superphysical powers at work in the world and serving men in various capacities. I realize this is a broad definition, but it is about the best we can do without going into a very extended discussion of the subject. What is the will of God? This is a nice, neat little question. And I think we must realize that when we conceive a universe to be the production of a divine plan, and to have originated in the consciousness of a divine being, we must observe or assume that this creation is purposeful, that it has a meaning, whether we are able to understand this meaning or not. And that meaning, which is inherent within the process of existence itself, has been referred to religiously as the divine will. This means that there is everywhere operating in the universe evidences of a sovereignty of plan and law and purpose. Some of the earlier philosophers assumed that the laws of God, as they are made manifested in creation, are themselves synonymous with the will of God. For that which God wills becomes the law by means of which the divine purpose is attained. The most common and obvious expression, therefore, of the divine will would be natural law. That law which has to do with the common works of man, both as these relate to his physical survival and to the growth of his mind and the supernatural or superphysical parts of himself. Generally speaking, the will of God is the purpose of God. This purpose made known through the power of divinity to impose its purpose. And to impose a purpose is to will a purpose. The universe is regarded by some scholars as the manifestation of the divine will moving through space and time. We therefore come to the conclusion that by the will of God is meant the plan by which the universe was created, is maintained, and will be brought to its ultimate ends. These ends may not be known to man, but they are assumed to rest in the divine mind. And it is assumed also that the divine mind is making certain that its purposes will be attained. The energy by which this certainty is justified and perpetuated and assured may be termed the divine will. Now let's see. There's one which we would like to consider only a little later because it does involve some of these controversial factors. Here is one that perhaps we can ask the question and you can all answer it for yourselves. That's one way when a situation gets a little difficult. If Jesus came in our midst today, what would he say about the great churches, elegant vestments worn by the clergy, while there are still so many poor and needy in our midst? Well, it would be a little difficult to speak for anyone else in this type of thing, but it is a generally assumed fact that nearly all of the great religious leaders of the world would be troubled by the condition into which their faiths have fallen. Shall we put it that way? In other words, most religions have fallen away from the simplicity and dignity of their beginnings. This falling away, however, is sometimes falsely blamed upon groups or individuals. I think this falling away is almost certainly a motion in accord with the natural inclination of man himself. It is very difficult for the individual not to enrich those things which he regards as sacred. It is very difficult for him to allow what he believes to be great or important to languish in obscurity or to remain penniless and unattended. Thus, to the degree that man has been appreciative in religion from the beginning of time, he has enriched the altars of his faith. Now, we may say that if he was a wiser man, he might expend this same wealth upon the service of his fellow man. This is morally and ethically true, and I do not think that most religions actually advise their followers to avoid charitable and philanthropic acts, or not to assist those in distress. The matter remains, however, that human nature, in its motions and changes, inevitably seems to encrust its faith with elaborate structures of worldliness, and no one in particular can be blamed. It is an inevitable tendency on the part of man. Our most primitive ancestors, when they came to worship at the altar of some carved image of an ancestor, brought food to this image, brought gifts, the presence of ivory and the teeth of animals. Anything that might be valuable was given to this name of deity. Some religions, of course, use this accumulation for philanthropic purposes. A good example of that was the Inca of Peru. These people received, the priesthood received the gifts of the people. Then these gifts, if not utilitarian, were destroyed in order that they might not add to the treasury or cause a sense of wealth to arise among the priesthood. Such things as were of common utility were then distributed among the poor in the name of deity. There are so many of these types of situations, not belonging to our faith but to all faiths, that it seems that while the highest end may not be thus attained, that it is simply instinct. Man cannot resist the desire to in some way express his appreciation. He has not yet become perhaps wise enough to do this merely by assisting his fellow man. He needs the symbol. He needs the evidence of the glorification of his faith in order to strengthen his own believing. We do not say this is true or right, but we say that it is part of the human psychological compound, and as yet that particular compound has not been dissolved by maturity of understanding. Here's a tricky one. We really have some good ones tonight. They're going to be interesting. This will be the opportunity to watch me wiggle. Now, this question, wherein and to what degree must we, the citizens of our state, accept the responsibility for capital punishment? What must we do? Well, I'm happy to say that we do not need to bear the full burden of this question tonight, as a discussion of this subject is the first title of my summer lecture program, so that we're going to get into that in due course. The problem of capital punishment has been experimented also upon by various peoples, nations, tribes, and clans since the dawn of history. And up to the present time, the matter has never been solved to everyone's satisfaction, and it probably never will be. The only final end to crime is not punishment, but the correction of cause. Up to the time when we strike out directly to prevent crime by certain major changes not only in our culture but in ourselves, until that time we will never be able, by any matter of penalty or punishment, to solve the problem of crime. And it will also be very difficult for us to ever justly punish any malefactor for anything that he does. Yet under our existing society, we have laws. And I think Abraham Lincoln came to the wisest conclusion that we can come to, namely that no one advances the cause of culture or essential good of mankind by breaking law, particularly a person claiming to have high principles. Socrates took the same attitude in relation to the unjust sentence of himself. He could easily have escaped. Plato would willingly have paid a small fine for his liberation. He could have been quietly removed from prison by the bribing of the guard and gone to another country where the people were very anxious to receive him with honors. Socrates refused to go. He said, I have been unjustly sentenced, and perhaps have every reason in the world to feel that I would justifiably save myself. But if I do this, then, and set this example, then little people without principles and without conscience will feel that they are entitled to do likewise. And I will set a wrong example to my fellow man. This I cannot do. Lincoln took this attitude and said that he would not harbor escaped slaves, but he would live to create a better law that would end this corrupt condition. I think we must all recognize, therefore, that we cannot approach this problem successfully by an open rebellion against the law. What we must try to do is to find the wisdom and the understanding to contribute to that motion which is already underway, by means of which these excesses or these errors in our criminal theory will be corrected. The only way that we can correct them is to correct the criminal tendency in ourselves. And this tendency is present. And there are very few persons in the course of life who do not break at least one civil law knowingly. The magnitude of the offense is not the principle involved. The person must keep the principles out of his own conscience. And until he can be so educated, we can never cease our efforts to improve the codes under which we live. Our codes should protect the right of the individual to grow into an honorable maturity. with every opportunity, every inducement, and every example to keep him straight. Until this condition is attained, we will never solve the essential, basic foundation which is the basis of crime in any civilized community. How did Plato differ from Aristotle on the age of the body compared to the soul? Essentially, Plato and Aristotle were in rather close agreement on these points, except that they expressed themselves in a rather different way. And because of the twofold approach to learning which distinguishes these schools, there is an apparent controversy. Yet Aristotle was essentially and basically a Platonist, although he gradually broke away, particularly on the level of what we would term scientific classification of knowledge. Plato did regard the body as being a temporary or passing instrument, and that therefore the age of the soul, which was an enduring principle in nature, must be greater than that of the body. Therefore, in the large principle of things, the soul has a subsistence or existence much more vast, much more enduring than that of the body. On the other hand, both Plato and Aristotle assumed to also be true the fact that various persons living in the body, by the development or the lack of development of their own psychic content, by either advancing the liberation of the psychic power through themselves or denying this liberation, could be, symbolically at least, divided into categories. That some persons were therefore regarded as being more awake or more mature as souls than other persons. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, however, did not assume that this was the result of a different age in the soul itself, but rather that it represented a different degree of personal devotion to the growth and unfoldment of the soul potential. The individual through whom the soul life is most completely revealed is the most mature. The person in whom the soul life is obscured is less mature. The growing child does not have as full a soul maturity as the adult, because the body limits in its immaturity the function of soul power. If the body, however, becomes mature, the inner thoughts and emotions of the individual may remain adolescent, and thereby again deny the right of the inner life to attain its full measure of dominion. Thus, a life in which the higher self is said to be unable to function is regarded as less mature than one in which the higher life is able to function. Also, the attitudes and conduct of the individual, his motives and his beliefs, his addictions, his habits, all these may affect the right of the soul to be itself. But in the universe, the soul power is always regarded as being older than the body, inasmuch as the soul is not created at the time of its entry into the body. Thus, whether the body be that of a highly evolved person or a lesser evolved person, the soul is always in its own right the leader of the body, the director of it. The soul, however, does not work miracles in the body. It can only make use of the legitimately attained development of the body and personality. So the unfoldment of the soul potential demands the dedication of the individual's life to such conduct, such searching, such idealism as may most rapidly reveal or release the psychic over self. I think that there is no essential difference in the position of Plato and Aristotle on this point. Perhaps Aristotle emphasized a little more the need of the lower personality to render itself suitable to express psychic potential. Perhaps Aristotle wanted man in the outer life to work harder for his soul, whereas Plato, believing in the contemplative way, held that the inner life could, through contemplation, have a greater part in the modification of the outer life. I think probably, again, Aristotle wanted man to outgrow his lesser self, whereas Plato wished the divine part to have a more positive participation in the improvement of character, that the soul should overcome the body, whereas in Aristotle the body should overcome itself and thus release the psychic potential. Here's a little different kind of question. Isn't it possible that the Russian people have a different concept of God than we try to force upon them, too, in our accusations that they are godless? Is it ethically right, I think, or right for us to act thus in these troubled times? I presume the person means to criticize the Russian people and accuse them of godlessness. I have not heard many individuals say that the Russians are a godless people. I think that perhaps is an exaggeration. There may be some who hold the view, but I do not think that the general concept that the Russians are a godless people is any more general than during World War II was the idea that all Germans were Nazis held in any great general mind. I think the attitude is that the Russian people are under the leadership of a group, that this group is, because of its basic addictions to the writings of Lenin, essentially an agnostic, if not atheistic group. We know that Russian government did attempt to restrict the religious practices of the Russian people, and that it was gradually necessary to relax this restriction because the demands of the people were far greater than the government could control. And today, religious places of worship, clergy and so forth, do exist in Russia, but they are frowned upon by the dominant communistic intellectual class. I do not think this is an exaggeration either. I think in this statement I could fairly well establish it, because we can establish it right here. Our present intellectual, many of our educators, many of our scientists, and many of our psychologists also frown upon the religious convictions of our people and would cheerfully destroy them or have them completely removed on the ground that religion is a superstition interfering with progress. If it happens here, by theory at least, it could well happen in a state where the scientific intellectual is very largely in power. I think the general's point is that so far as I know from the study of religion in pre-Tsarist Russia, and from what I have been able to learn from the discussion of this problem with metropolitans of the Russian Church as it is today, I do not believe that Russian religion is essentially different or has an essentially different concept of God than what we have in the West. Russian religion, however, is not only the Russian Orthodox Church. Russia has always been steeped in mysticism. Much of this mysticism has had Asiatic rooting and has drifted in from across the great plains of Tatary. Also, mystical sects, secret societies, groups devoted to religious visions and things of that nature have been flourishing in Russia for centuries. Sects that correspond rather closely to our understanding of the Bogomils and the Albigensian heretics. Russia did have a tremendous amount of religious mysticism under the surface of itself. I do not think, however, that this mysticism is without parallel in Western mysticism, or that any unique or different concept exists. It's quite possible that religion in Russia today is more socialized than it is in this country. But I think the faith of the Russian people is very much an Orthodox faith. A faith, however, which is deep and sincere, emotional, as we find among all Slavic peoples, and not different, essentially, from the religion of the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Armenian Church, or the other Serbian or Montenegrin churches, the Yugoslavian Church, and others of the regions. I think that the general attitude on religion is very much the same as our own, particularly our religious sentiments in comparatively small rural areas or in Latin countries. I think it'd be very close to that in general religious concept. I would certainly see no advantage in criticizing these people or declaring them to be godless, because I think when we make such a statement, we are referring only to a very thin level of intellectuals. And this type of level is appearing everywhere. So if we do not particularly admire it in Russia, then we should not admire it here, which unfortunately is not the case. We admire here what we do not admire in Russia. This situation has already been referred to by a number of able thinkers, and I believe this answers or expresses their basic opinion. Here is a question: what can be gained by all this? I seem to sense a weary soul here somewhere. What will the infinite gain if it is everything already? Now, this belongs to a class of questions, which I note there are several in this basket, and these questions are among the most basic in the entire field of religious thought. And because they are most basic, and because they retire to the most unanswerable of all foundations, we might as well consider several of them as a group and try to point out the situation as it actually is. Not long, several years ago now, a friend with whom I was discussing some problems said, I would like very much to know what is going on in the back of Joseph Stalin's mind. Well, a lot of people probably would like to know that, but no one is going to or did find out what was going on in the back of his mind, and not too much about what was going on in the front of his mind. A man is simply unable and incapable of estimating what is going on in the mind of God. We may as well face this now. In order to have a complete comprehension of the divine purpose, we would have to be identical in comprehending power with the infinite itself. We have no such ability. We have no concept of the infinite progression of cosmic orders which make up the citizenry of space. We have so little knowledge of even the finites of our own planet. We are still unable to agree as to why we're here, where we came from, or where we're going. Most people cannot agree upon the simple problems of daily conduct. Therefore, it is not possible for man to answer these vast abstractions. The only way he can attempt to answer them is to indulge in abstractions or in words or in sentences which he cannot himself understand even after he has stated them. He has to take refuge in words. Words are not identical with meaning, and even the most perfectly turned phrase, which might cause universal admiration, will tell us no more than we knew before. The greatest of our world thinkers have therefore flatly denied the profit of going into this problem. Socrates refused to discuss the nature of first cause, or to attempt to discover what was going on in the mind of God. Confucius took the same position. He said any such discussion, any such questing after infinites is beyond the reasonable power of a finite being. Buddha, I think, summarized it most completely. His disciples asked these questions time and time again. Buddha always simply refused to answer. He said, I could give you answers to some of these matters from the position of understanding which Buddha had attained through the illumination. He could answer certain questions, but even if he answered them, the hearer would not understand what he was saying, because he would be speaking from a different experience, one that the disciple did not share. Therefore, the proper problem of mankind is man. Our real problem is to find the simple and natural answers to the immediate issues, realizing that as we grow, as we unfold, as we become more enlightened as beings, we shall have greater participation in the knowledge of causes. But to attempt to debate these things, to try to create sects around various interpretations of the infinite purpose, such efforts are merely to continue the struggle and confusion of faiths, because we can arrive at no universally acceptable conclusion. This being the case, the only answers that we have to most of these questions is simply this: the universe exists. The laws which we observe are actually functional. These laws have been studied in part by individuals who understand in part. From these laws we gain certain intimations. We become aware of certain reasonable probabilities, and upon these we must base our effort to understand that which is not obvious or not immediately available to us. Everywhere around us we perceive the outworkings of a lawful plan. There seems to be no probability that the universe is an accident, or that the procedures which surround us are unreasonable, irrational, or inconstant. We must therefore come to the natural conclusion that the administrating power knows what it is doing, and that this administrating power either possesses a truth factor within itself, which is absolute and unlimited, or else this factor shares in some vast knowledge of particular things by which it is able to achieve its end. As we cannot question this rationally, reasonably, we have only the choice of accepting, upon the evidence of things seen and known, the nature and structure of things unseen and unknown. Everything that we see and know would indicate that there is a reason for what happens, that there is a purpose to be attained, that we are here because it is necessary to the unfoldment of the divine purpose that we be here. And if we have any faith whatever in the nature of deity, we must assume that this purpose is just, is reasonable, that we are not here for no purpose. We are not here merely to justify a whim. As to how it may happen that a deity, all-knowing in itself, should precipitate into life from itself unknowing creatures, and that these unknowing creatures must ultimately be restored to a state of knowledge, we can, for a moment, take some hope, perhaps, in the concept of the gnosis, or the Gnostics on this matter. Namely, that deity is not totally independent from its creation. That deity, like an incarnated being, is embodied in that which it creates. That creation, therefore, as also the Neoplatonists maintained, is the body of a blessed God, to paraphrase Plato. Consequently, as the body must pass from infancy through childhood and adolescence in order to release the life which is within it, it is quite conceivable and possible that what we call the growth of man is actually the gradual releasing of the divine power, which is locked in incarnation, and that the resurrection of the divine being is attained through the perfection of the creatures which it has fashioned. This is one viewpoint. It can be opposed, but perhaps it is as good as another, inasmuch as this would indicate what we do know, that life is infinite growth. Therefore, that we grow must have some relationship to divine growth. We are not here simply because it was an interesting notion. We are here because in some way our growth is essential to the ultimate purpose of the plan. We cannot prove this, but we would look very foolish trying to disprove it. For in so doing, we would simply step off the end of a precipice into oblivion. Therefore, we must weigh all things and cling to that which most completely explains the situation as it is, with honor to man, glory to God, and the acceptance of the dignity of universal law. Now here's a friend who wants to know what experiences support or indicate the concept that we are growing as spiritual beings, progressing in our understanding of life. What experiences indicate that we have less understanding and ability than at the beginning of our existence? I think that the problem of the evidence to support the concept of growth is perhaps best attained or best accumulated by the quiet contemplation of ourselves. If today we are not a little wiser than we were yesterday, we have a certain sense of non-fulfillment. The individual who today makes the mistakes that he made 10 years ago is apt to be rather annoyed at himself. Every factor of living, even within the short span of 80 years, indicates the natural progressive increase of experience factor in our own makeup, that we bring more and more skill to our trades and crafts. Experience makes us a better carpenter, a better mechanic. Experience is necessary to the successful practice of medicine, or of law, or of engineering. Therefore, in all ordinary and normal pursuits, we have evidence beyond doubt that theory without experience is inadequate. Therefore, by experience or by practice, by some method of apprenticeship in life, we become proficient in the various activities which we like or which are necessary for our survival. If, therefore, a man like Paderewski can, through a course of experience, training, and discipline, become an outstanding musician, a condition which would not have been possible had he not lived his music, had he not dedicated himself to it, had he not familiarized himself with its principles, and then patiently exercised these principles throughout his lifetime, If, therefore, in ordinary matters, we see that experience advances our ability to be, to do, and to understand, I think we have no reason to doubt that the greater experiences of existence have a similar purpose, and also that we should trace in our own life the beneficial total experience of living. For whereas a specialized experience may make us artists or musicians, generalized experience makes us great human beings. And I do not see how we can reasonably avoid the implications of the things known and seen. I do not think there are any experiences which indicate that we are less than we were. Actually, there might be what we would term indications of decadence. A culture may pass through decadence and may lose its vitality. An individual may enter into advanced years and lose certain vitality of mind, perhaps even becoming senile, or entering into that dreamy time we refer to as second childhood. I do not think, however, that the second childhood of individuals, or the second childhood of tired old cultures or races that are going to rest, or the experiences of a civilization falling apart because of its own immaturities, I do not think that these represent a regression or an actual loss. They represent rather situations in which aged or fatigued things, or things by their own dissipation made no longer useful, cannot remain or continue as carriers of progress. Progress, however, simply bypasses these things and continues on its own way. The world may have regarded civilization as falling to pieces when the Roman Empire collapsed. But actually, this collapse was paralleled by the rise of new cultures and the appearance of evidences of basic progress, which might never have been possible had the Roman Empire continued. Therefore, individuals can fall behind. Persons can make mistakes. We may be able to apparently die as foolish as when we were born, or even more so. But in this very procedure, our foolishness begins to hurt us. We begin to recognize certain lessons whether we admit them or not. And in the large pattern of existence, we are moving forward, either because of ourselves or in spite of ourselves. I do not think there is any real evidence that progress can cease. The only evidence is that certain instruments of progress can fail, but that progress then simply moves on and takes on new instrumentalities. Let's see. Here's a nice little thought just up on the top corner of this nice large sheet of white paper. Please explain the mode and or method of the application of religion and philosophical principles in daily living. Well, this is a large question again because we are dealing with a great many different situations that can arise. Actually, the primary application of philosophy to life may be described as the increase of thoughtfulness in relationship to conduct. The individual learns by philosophy to think prior to action, to direct conduct, rather than to be required to gather up the fragments of mistakes and try to put something together that has already fallen apart. Thus, the contribution of philosophy is the thoughtful contemplation of action, both before the action is performed, in order that it may be as reasonable as possible, and after the action has been performed, in order that its consequences or outcomes may be most perfectly understood in terms of value. From philosophy, the individual gains the courage to examine himself, to compare his own conduct with his own concept, to determine what part of his nature he is using in the advancement of his principles and purposes. By philosophy also he gains a certain skill in anticipating difficulty and strengthens faculties which will bring reasonable solutions when crisis or stress appear. I would say that the principal method of applying philosophy to life is to gradually become conversant with a sound, basic philosophic system. Observe its recommendations for character and conduct, and apply them as nearly as possible to the conduct of our own affairs. If we follow the procedures, we will not be far from the facts. The application of religion to the problems of living may be perhaps defined as the achievement of a condition of faith as superior to a state of fear. Faith represents a certain emotional stability within the life of the person. The belief in the reality of God, in the victory of good over evil, and the immortality of the human soul, if actually incorporated into us as a conscious acceptance verified through the experiences of living, will give us the victory of faith over fear. For we cannot believe in the goodness of God and fear at the same time. Thus in religion also, it is a process of the gradual searching for acceptance and understanding of a simple, direct, adequate religious conviction, by means of which we are strengthened in our moral values, encouraged to deepen our spiritual integrity, and to live by a positive type of faith which will not permit us to perform an action contrary to the good as it is given to us to know the good. Thus religion essentially is an emotional acceptance of truth and an effort to live according to the principles of truth as they are known, rather than abstract truths which we cannot comprehend. Philosophy is the living of a reasonable life, a life in which we perform no action that is inconsistent with common sense, and with a consistent, integrated philosophical purpose and a strong faith, we should be able to meet most of the emergencies of life with hope and strength and dedication of life and purpose. Now we're getting into some long ones. From the old books, we admire the genius of the Rosicrucian authors and members who carried on similar work, to that of the mystery schools in their search for scientific and philosophical understanding. Is there any trace today of the same dedication and organization that will provide the world with progress rather than with annihilation from the advanced knowledge which the scientists are receiving? Well, here again we break into two lines of thought. In the world, two great systems of thinking have always dominated, forming the two hemispheres of man's world of wisdom. The first of these, and the oldest, of course, is the Eastern Hemisphere of wisdom, which is essentially based upon the concept that man must work out his own salvation, that what occurs to him is the result of his own conduct, that each person must face the responsibilities of his own action. In the Western world, we have rather chosen in our Western hemisphere of thinking to depend largely upon leadership, upon authority, and upon the possibility of electing representation to advance our causes. We have hoped that we would produce among men one man or a few men who might lead us through this troubled era into the promised land. Whether we regard these as simply political leaders, more enlightened than the normal run, or whether we regard them as adepts or masters, representing an intercession of a superior wisdom, the end concept is the same. In the East, that man must save himself, and in the West, that man must be saved. The circumstances of the technique of salvation come under the minutiae of the subject. They are not the main issues. I think in this particular respect, we may have faith in the authority of enlightened leaders, but we must also have philosophic consolation in the recognition of our own personal responsibilities in these matters. We have no assurance in this Western world that situations will iron themselves out without some major crisis, some major disaster. We do have, however, the philosophic assurance in ourselves that even as religion itself has pointed out, though the thousands fall upon the right hand and thousands upon the left hand, the just man shall not be moved. We must believe that the universe is honest, and that in this honorable purpose of things, the innocent will not suffer with the guilty, nor will the guilty avoid punishment because of the generosity of the victim. That in some pattern here, we have justice. Our main concern is that we shall so conduct ourselves that we can continually take refuge in this complete consolation that whatever justice there is in space, we are with that justice ourselves. That in the just course of things, we will not be punished because we do not deserve punishment. Thus, the importance of trying to establish our own integrities. And experience also shows to us that regardless of the corruptions of a time, the average individual can always live with reasonable integrity. He has the right to choose. He has the right to sacrifice that which is not right. He has the right also to inner convictions. And even under the most heartless tyranny, the inner life of a person is still his own. Therefore, it is our primary problem to do everything conceivable and possible, which for most of us is not too much as individuals, to advance and protect these causes which we cherish. And having made as large a public service as is possible, that it is then our duty to investigate our own lives, to make certain that no matter what happens, we are in the full possession of our own virtues and integrities, as we do not believe in a destructive providence, as we do not believe that death is the end of existence, as we do not believe that the spiritual values of reality are destructible or corruptible. We realize that the most tragedy is that physical appearances will change. Things with which we are accustomed may be swept away. But values cannot be destroyed for us unless we destroy them in ourselves. And on that basis, we can meet these problems, fully aware that as citizens of the universe, we are just as important as any other part of nature. And that universal integrity which marks each sparrow's fall is not unmindful of the just man in his emergency. The question is, are we the just man? And the question will still be not how long we are going to live, but how well. And nothing that is real can be destroyed. Nothing that is unreal can be perpetuated. And over these inevitables, let us not grieve. Let us rather go to work and do what we can right now. Let's see what we have here. Is it generally true that the difference in occult instruction between the exoteric and the esoteric is the fact that the exoteric consists of written forms or public lectures, whereas the esoteric is conveyed by a guru to his chela or disciple in a verbal manner for his personal instruction? Well, as one well-known Southern politician observed on one occasion, yes, and then again, no. This is not quite as clear as that, or quite as simple. The term exoteric is generally interpreted to mean that which is in common, or held by most persons, and when applied to religion, means the state religion, or the religion available to all the people, or the common faith, or faiths, or such religious instruction and doctrine as is available to all. This may be written, it may be communicated orally, it may be conveyed by parables or fables or through works of art. It may be the traditional religion of our people. It can be whatever we have a right to share by the birthright of our own humanity. Whereas the term esoteric, which has gotten into very bad company, by the way, generally means knowledge about the secret causes of things, or of such motions and circumstances as are not apparent. I would not say that information is esoteric because it is revealed orally, because I have heard things that are not only not esoteric, but are not even common sense that have been revealed orally. Nor can we say that a knowledge is esoteric simply because a group refuses to circulate it. Knowledge is not esoteric because you have to pay dues to hear it. Nor is it esoteric because it belongs to a cult that does not wish to distribute it to others of other cults. Actually, esoteric has nothing primarily to do with the method of communication, because you cannot judge things that way any more than you can say that a person is entitled to esoteric instructions after he has belonged to an organization for 5 years. Esoteric instruction probably also implies that type of instruction which is communicated principally internally, or arises from methods or means or situations which cannot be shared in common, but must result from certain growth, maturity, or unfoldment earned by the individual by his own conduct. I would say that esoteric, therefore, would indicate that which may be communicated only as the result of growth, and that however it is communicated, it can only be understood or assimilated by a person who has achieved certain individual progress. I do not know whether this point is obvious and clear or not, but the main point we want to make is that esoteric means that which cannot be commonly shared, because the majority of persons are incapable of understanding it, not because it is denied to them by any arbitrary system set up by man. Esoteric means also a very relative thing. To the child who is too young to go to school, the multiplication table is esoteric. After he has learned the multiplication table, algebra may still be esoteric. After he has grown up to the point where he understands algebra and is able to comprehend it, then trigonometry may be esoteric, and that one he may never quite reach, unless he has specialized aptitudes or inclinations. So esoteric does not also imply necessarily sacred, or something that is a profound secret. In fact, in ordinary literature, we learn that the methods used by certain East Indian communities in dyeing fabrics are held as esoteric secrets, communicated only after a long apprenticeship, and then by degrees, and then usually only to a person by birth or marriage a member of a clan. This is one way of looking at esoteric. It is something which is not commonly available for one reason or another. But this reason, in a mystical or philosophical meaning, is not based upon membership or upon any financial consideration or any particular group consideration. In mystical or metaphysical matters, it is an increased or enlarged state of comprehension which must be earned. Therefore, the guru or teacher may communicate such information only after he is satisfied that the disciple, by the practice of certain disciplines, has earned the power to understand correctly and use properly the knowledge which is entrusted to him. Thus, true esoteric would be that beyond our present knowledge, to which we are entitled if we are willing to earn it and will guarantee to use it well. That is probably about all that we can say on that subject. Can a sincere Western student obtain any esoteric assistance other than that presented by books? You will gain no esoteric assistance from books, not because the content of a book may be either exoteric or esoteric. An example is the Tao Te King of Lao Tzu. This book is available in 100 editions in Chinese and probably 50 in English. Yet it is an esoteric work, and it has guarded itself so perfectly that neither the Englishman nor the Chinese knows very much about it, although he can have it in an assortment of editions. The only thing that he can gain is that which his own insight will reveal to him. Therefore, we cannot say that that which is esoteric is never in a book. Nor can we say that that which is exoteric is always in a book. We can only say that the esoteric, as far as the book is concerned, is the ability to read what is between lines, or to sense, because of our own increasing capacity, meaning which perhaps otherwise might be obscure. In this sense, the growth of the individual always makes available what we commonly call esoteric knowledge. As the great French transcendentalist the Abbé Louis Constant observed on one occasion, a man cast away on a desert island with no earthly possession except a spring of water, a palm tree, and a few birds, will, when his own internal life reaches a certain degree of maturity, receive inevitably such instruction as he requires, because his own consciousness pulls it out, and he can find it just as easily in the spring of water, the cloud, and the palm tree. Nothing can keep it from him if it is his. Nothing can bestow it upon him if it is not his. And all promises are vanity. Now, let's see what else we have here. I've held these because they're really almost books, and I want to make sure that we have no briefer theses that we can consider first. Now, I'll tell you, we are now, with the exception of these specialized documents, we are now down to last week's remainders. I think this, really, we almost need to be an octopus to handle this situation, but we'll do the best that we can. The next group of questions, which are on these large sheets of paper, seem to have been contributed by individuals either consciously or subconsciously acquainted with each other, and follow very much the same pattern. And both of them are concerned considerably with a publication issued years ago by the Theosophical Society entitled The Mahatma Letters. And I'm not going to enter into any conflict with the Mahatmas this evening or attempt to explain what they refuse to explain. But we will perhaps be able to help one or two situations that seem to have arisen. In a letter by the Master Kutumi, or K.H., addressed to Hume, there is reference to the non-existence of a God, or an intelligent consciousness in the manifested universe. How is this to be reconciled with the law of correspondences, of analogy, of the existence of the relationships between microcosms and macrocosms, or as above, so below, etc.? In the below, we have consciousness and subconsciousness, cerebrum and cerebellum on the physical level. We have a measure of intelligence apparently capable of choosing and discriminating within or contrary to the laws of nature. Now, this goes on a little bit further, but let's pause for a moment and see what we can do with this. I think we must realize that the original concepts as set forth by Madame Blavatsky, Mr. Sinnett, and Alcott, and to a measure in Hume and Judge, and as found in the Secret Doctrine and the Esoteric Papers of the Theosophical Society, the overshadowing generality in this original course of things was Buddhism. And Madame Blavatsky herself observed on at least one occasion that she liked to be regarded as a Buddhist. Well, this would bring us naturally to the idea that an Eastern wisdom system, whether it be Vedic or Buddhic, whether it relates to Tibetanism or Tantric philosophy or yoga, that in all of these systems there is this underlying conviction that what might be termed the basic reality of existence is not what in the West we term consciousness. This would naturally present a difficult situation in the effort to reconcile the two systems of thought. Buddhism, as it was the springboard for most of the opinions set forth in the Mahatma Letters, either by K.H. or M., must therefore have some bearing upon the opinions of these illustrious teachers. Let's try to understand it perhaps in a little more simple manner by reference to the principal concepts of Buddhism. We've already mentioned this evening that Buddha simply declined to answer questions concerning the super-essential causes of things. He held, according to most Western believers, a nihilistic attitude. He apparently held that the ultimate state of things is a non-existence, and therefore that the end of all human or divine effort is re-identification with non-being, or extinction, as the Westerner would express that concept. When you are not anything, you are nothing, says the Westerner. When you are not a thing, you are all things, says the Easterner. And the difference in the perspective is rather intriguing and a little devastating, especially to a religious group where the personality of deity has long been one of the most important concepts. We have no actual evidence from Buddhism, however, that Buddha wished to imply that the Mahaparinirvana, was the total extinction of being. What he is actually telling us, or attempted to communicate to us, was that it was the total extinction of the state of consciousness which we now know. And that in our own cheerful egotism, we have assumed that anything that we do not know is vacuum. That if it isn't like the way we experience it here, it just isn't. We have no proof of this. In fact, we have much to suggest that if the infinite is greater than we are, it should certainly do better than we do in the processes of conscious expression. Buddhism, therefore, affirms that the positive condition of the ultimate is simply incomprehensible, and that there is nothing in it that is reminiscent of the conditioned existence which we know. The unconditioned cannot be merely a rarefication of the conditioned. The unconditioned must be different. If it is different from consciousness, we assume it means unconsciousness. But that is our assumption on the basis of our own limited insight. Buddha likened, therefore, the true state of being to dreamless sleep, pointing out that in dreamless sleep something continues by which we automatically awaken. Therefore, that although we are unconscious, something continues to exist. Man in his present state, obscured by body, and incapable of a function other than that highly conditioned by his sensory instruments, basing practically all of his mentation and conscious experience upon the polarization of opposites and upon the acceptance into his own intellectual structure of the testimonies of exterior object sense conditions, is simply unable to even state the nature of himself. The only way the individual can define himself is to say he is not somebody else. If he looks inside of himself for this core of consciousness, he finds nothing. He cannot turn in to find the root even of his own opinion, let alone his own consciousness. Buddha therefore held that the effort to speculate upon the nature of consciousness is frustrated by the fact that all we know about it is that which is conditioned by the limitations of our brain, our sensory perception, and the very restricted area of our mental and emotional experience. None of these making us sufficiently aware of facts to justify an expert opinion from us. So it is quite possible that K.H. is therefore merely pointing out that which is a basic premise in Buddhism, namely that what we call consciousness, what we would consider to be the old gentleman resembling the one on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, it cannot be regarded as a reality. That the positing of a kind of humanly created super-consciousness at the root of life and calling it God would not in Buddhism be a legitimate procedure. This does not mean, however, that in the nature of the Paratma there is nothing. There is merely that about which we know nothing. And in the actual substance of the matter, all that is real is unknown. Therefore, total reality is inconceivable. And consciousness is merely a secondary instrument necessary to our function in a particular state, a state of relationship with objectivity. If, therefore, we lose all consciousness of objectivity, even in the yogic experience of samadhi, we lose sense of self and not self. And when we lose sense of self, what is left with which to define that which is not self? If the individual in samadhi transcends his own existence to the degree that he is no longer aware of his own existence, what faculties will he use in an effort to become aware of divine existence? For divine existence by him can be defined only by his own faculties, or can be experienced only by himself. The suspension of himself ends his possibility of experiencing any other relationship. So where does the situation rest? It rests, I believe, to bring it down to simpler thinking, in the concept that the inevitable, eternal, superessential reality of things is not definable, not conceivable by man, and that all conception, whether in terms of consciousness or of person, in terms of intellect or of energy, can only be man stating the limitation of himself in his effort to define the nature of that which is not limited. Under those conditions, and on that background, I think it would be quite possible to reconcile this concept with that of other East Indian philosophies, and to a certain degree with some of the mystical opinions of Western idealists. For the experience of the total suspension of self is part of mysticism. And if you reach a point where you are no longer aware of yourself, are incapable of saying I, or are incapable of differentiating yourself from anything else, in such a state, how will you define that which is superior or inferior to self? You cannot, because in this suspension you have also suspended the faculties of definition. The only thing that can remain, therefore, is an experience of identity with totality. And what this implies, Buddha would not say, and I question if it would do any good for us to try and say. But we do not need to assume that the end of personal existence, as we know it, is the end of being, or of true existence, or for that matter of ourselves. For we have no way of knowing at this stage of our growth whether this personal consciousness that we talk about is even part of ourselves, in the sense that it has any bearing upon the true self. It is quite possible that the true self transcends consciousness as completely as the infinite transcends man's God concept. Now that that is perfectly clear, we will pass on to something else. There, let's see. Well, I think that as long as we have another question relating to this, we'll see whether the other question bears out something that the first friend asks. I think in very all probabilities this is again a good statement of the same question. The friend asks what Jesus meant when he said, the Father and I, or I and the Father are one. I think that this is also expressed in the true sense of mystical at-one-ment. In other words, Jesus is expressing or explaining a mystical experience of union or identification, which is very similar to that recorded of mystics in all parts of the East and West. The Buddhist has the same type of experience, so has the Muslim mystic, namely the identity of self with the universal principle. This would be a Buddhist statement, by the way, because if Jesus and the Father be one, and as Jesus elsewhere states that he is in the Father, and the Father is in him, then by this is implied a universal being or presence, or essence, or transcendent reality, to which man can verge, or with which he can be associated, or with which he can become identical. And having reached this identity, proclaims that not his will, but the will of the Father be done in all things. I think this is simply a statement of man's mystical surrender to the universal, and his recognition of his own basic identity with that universal. Therefore, that there is a sovereignty which takes over man, and with which man becomes one. As Arnold tells us in The Light of Asia, the nirvana is like the dewdrop slipping back into the shining sea. And the mystical experience is man's individual consciousness sort of slipping back, or gradually, mystically losing itself in the consciousness of transcendence. But what is this consciousness of transcendence? Most mystics have never given us a description of the condition. Jesus does not. He merely states the experience of oneness with God, or with the Father. He states it with a certain emotional stress because he does use the term Father, rather than the concept of an abstract deity. Therefore, there is a warmth, a sense of relationship to a paternal principle involved. But of course, we must also realize that we have language problems here that influence our ability to understand exactly what he meant. But the mystical experience is nearly always the loss of self in God. And the mystics, where they have attempted to explain this, do not give the impression, and in fact they state definitely, that this loss of self in God is not loss of self into a superior person, but a sudden participation of total consciousness, in which one and the infinite become identified. And in this always, consciousness as we know it ceases. Therefore, what is experienced may be called consciousness, but technically it is not consciousness as we understand it, because it is not consciousness capable of saying, I am. It is not consciousness capable of self-knowledge. It is a condition, a plus condition. And those who have experienced it or tried to experience it, as Havelock Ellis tells us in his Dance of Life, have usually experienced it simply as a tremendous, immediate sense of universal well-being. That there can be no longer any insecurity or doubt that a fullness takes over the comparative emptiness of our ordinary sensory relationships with life. But all of these mystics, Bamy and many others, have pointed out the absolute poverty of words, have indicated clearly that the condition cannot be adequately described by anyone. That it is not simply an individual knowing more than he did before, nor is it an individual suddenly sitting down in front of a being that knows more than he does and listening while it instructs him. This is not the type of thing at all. It is a union with a state of existence which does not convey the impression of all knowledge, but the impression of total integration without knowledge. Simply an awareness of some nature, of total meaning, without being able to describe this meaning. As one poet says, who names it shall never find it, and for the one who finds it, it needs no name. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, said, this is the journey of the alone to that which is alone. That it is an experience that cannot be expressed in terms of consciousness as we understand consciousness at all. And that the end of it, as in the mystics of Islam, is not that we become wise, or that we become immortal, or that we become all-knowing, or that we become masters of destiny. The experience as expressed in the Muslim mystics is that we simply become the slave of the beloved. We simply become totally acceptant. What we accept, we do not know. But there seems to be no way of resisting it, because this tremendous value of adoration sweeps over us, and we live only to serve the beloved. And this beloved, in this case, representing this divine power, which is never expressed with hands and feet, or with thoughts or ideas, or with doctrines or creeds or anything of that nature, but simply an overwhelming sublimity. The totality of man's sense that he is all and nothing, as Bamy calls it. Nothing in all in nothing. That it transcends any experience that we have. Therefore, the consciousness, as we apply it, you look in the dictionary, consciousness is self-awareness, or has this as a basic element. This mystical state is total not self-awareness. And in the total not self-awareness, something seems to open, and total awareness moves in upon the individual. He realizes that he cannot be aware of the infinite, but that in some way the infinite becomes aware of him. That he cannot lead, he can only follow. That when he opens his mouth, it is the Father who speaketh the words. This is a simple, childish way of stating it, but the fact remains essentially true, that man ceases, and only the Father exists. And this existence cannot be defined in critical terms. We just haven't got the language, and we cannot restore it in the face of the fact that the most mystically illumined of all time have admitted that it is incomprehensible. Therefore, we can talk around it and about it, we can argue of it and against it, but the fact is not to be known except in that infinite and ultimate in which we become identical with that fact. Otherwise, it has to remain merely theory. This carries part of the other question that was asked. Here is a question. Partly, they are again quoting from the Mahatma letters, this time in connection with mind. The problem would become rather too complicated to attempt to answer in a meeting of this nature. There is so much teaching, for instance, constantly urging dependence in and search for the inner soul. But if the soul, as the intelligent link between matter and spirit, itself an evolutionary or slowly awaking force, how can it be an all-wise arbiter of action, unless its link with the spirit has become all-powerful? Here again, we do not use words well, and even in the most careful study, we know from experience that the term soul, as it is used in psychology, religion, philosophy, art, even music, that this word has come to be comparatively meaningless as far as clear definition is concerned. Now, this question brings up a matter as to what is meant by the search for the inner soul. I think we have to be very prosaic in interpreting this line, keeping away from all of the implications that would divide the meaning from the average intellection of a 14-year-old child. I think we understand that the soul of a thing is its meaning. That is, it is essence. The soul of a picture is that which it tells, that which illumines it from within itself. So that the soul, in the most practical and simple terms, represents the motivation behind action. It represents the qualities which shine through into the expression of outers. We think of the soul of music, and we think of the soul of the inanimate thing, the soul of a great piece of statuary, the soul of a noble writing. We think of soul power as in some sense an inner value by which we can transcend brute power, as in the definition given by Mohandas Gandhi, that the world must sometime recognize the victory of soul power over brute power. What he means there is not a psychic energy, but the power of value, the power of goodness, of beauty, of faith, of hope, and of love. He isn't making in this case the soul a psychological entity. He is giving it as a general term to signify the superiority of good things over things less good, the inner motives over the outer form of things, the life within a body, its victory over that body. Therefore, the soul of a person is not only some kind of a psychic entity or a spiritual nucleus or something of that nature. It is also the natural beauty, the natural kindness, the natural gentility of that person. The impression that they give us is that they are a good soul, a kindly soul, a generous soul, or a selfish soul. These terms mean that we sense their motives as coming through them in whatever instrumentation is available to them. The search for soul, therefore, is the search for value. The search for soul is merely another way of trying to discover the greatest meaning in ourselves, the greatest value, the best of ourselves. And we have always discovered that the best of ourselves is not on the outside, but is somewhere invisible on the inside. That the best of ourselves is not what we see in the mirror, but a strength of character, a dedication of purpose, an honorableness, a charitableness, and that somewhere in the confusion of good and bad, making up our moral ethical structure, there are things better than other things, and that these best things represent a hope. They represent the seed of a growth, and also they testify to the fact that there is a betterness in things, which may be called forth. And we also learn that there is a certain happiness, a certain rich fulfillment, a certain reward in dedicating ourselves to these better parts of ourselves, thus becoming, so to say, instruments for the release of a soul power through our own action and conduct. Now, in some ancient times, the soul is not only the symbol of these good things in general, but the soul is a compound or complex of mental and emotional factors. The soul, therefore, has gradually become identified with an invisible structure made up of those parts of our nature which obviously do exist because we use them constantly, but which are not visible as any part of our physical structure. We know the mind has an existence because we use it. Therefore, the mind becomes part of our psychic endowment. We know our emotions exist because they burst through us on many different occasions, or they become the basis of a great emotional or aesthetic achievement in our lives. Therefore, there are real parts of ourselves that cannot be measured or weighed or estimated as we study body. They cannot be discovered by dissection. They have to be discovered by certain meditative processes of introversion, by which we become gradually aware of the full nature of our own lives. Now, the Greeks also held that the two opposites of nature, which they term spirit and matter, represented the ultimate polarities of one condition, ether and chaos, or as Bamy called it, bis and abyss, time and eternity. These two vast opposites are not really two different things, but are rather the conditions of one thing. The Greeks held, therefore, that spirit and matter are conditions of each other, that one might be regarded as the greatest degree of itself, and the other the least degree of the same. Therefore, matter is the least degree of spirit, having no separate quality, but differentiated by what the Greeks call privation, or the fact that matter had been given this privation because life, drawing itself to its own central focus, as in the case of a sun, withdraws its energy from the surrounding field, which therefore becomes negative to it. And that field becomes matter, because in it the degree of spiritual penetration is less, because the spirit has been united to form the solar energy and now radiates upon rather than through the substance. So the ancients held that spirit and matter represented two conditions or polarities, one being the greatest degree of density, which is spirit, the other the greatest degree of solidity, which is matter. Therefore the ancients held that worlds or planets were holes gouged out of the density of space, that solidity is a vacuum or comparative vacuum in density. This could probably be subjected to considerable research in view of modern theories. But the point we want to make is that the ancients declared that spirit reacting as light or energy upon matter, and matter releasing through itself the germinal seeds of its own impoverished life principle, that these working one upon the other come into manifestation or come into a certain integration by what is called form. Form being a compound. Form is not matter, but matter and life together in compound result in form. Form is therefore an area of energy set apart by boundaries of law and order. And all bodies are forms, combining in their structure both life principles and material principles, held together in a certain evolving compound, so that forms are in a constant state of growth, growth being the increase of the life content and the corresponding gradual decrease of the matter content. The gradual transmutation of matter into energy is therefore one of the essential principles of evolution. Forms, therefore, are archetypes, patterns, or designs the Platonists referred to as the souls of things. Therefore, a soul is a form. It is a compound. It is a product of the union of spirit and matter, producing a form, itself invisible, called an archetype. But this form becoming the basis of the manifestation of a physical structure, this physical structure being a gradual expression of a formal nature through body. That form determines body. That is why form being superior to body, the generation of chickens will not result in the birth of hogs. These archetypal forms, though invisible, determine the genera, species, and types, and keep them within their natural and reasonable boundaries. Thus soul becomes, so to say, the formal principle, the archetype of body, and occupies, as Pythagoras points out, the middle distance between spirit and body. Your messianic beings are psychologically and archetypally soul symbols, placed between spirit and matter. Therefore Jesus says, "Who hath seen me hath seen the Father," inasmuch as the psychic inner polarity represents this manifestation of the divine. The soul or psychic focus, thereby becoming the center through which superiors descend into bodies, and up which inferiors ascend to be reunited with spiritual energies and principles. Thus, involution is the descent of the psychic entity into body. Evolution, the gradual release of this psychic entity from body, as described by Socrates. I have to hasten this discussion and leave out a lot of things you probably want to ask questions about, but we simply cannot go much further in the time that we have. Therefore, the question that is asked here, I think it is evident now that the psychic nature, as Buddha points out, is not a being. It is a focal point between energy and matter, by which the constantly changing degrees of energy matter result in a constantly changing psychic compound. This compound, as it changes, modifies the conduct patterns, inasmuch as these conduct patterns are simply expressions of the same energies in operation. I would think, therefore, that the natural concept of religions would be that man, seeking his soul, is seeking first his own inner life, and having established himself morally and ethically upon this foundation, then will continue beyond this psychic state toward a still superior state. Psychologically, this psychic state is susceptible of certain illusions resulting from the confusion of the mental emotional structure. Therefore, we cannot be sure that that psychically experienced is actually true. But we can assume, as most mystics have, that to the degree that we can simplify our own psychic life, reducing the intensities of personal thought and emotion, we become more susceptible to the presence of universal thought and emotion moving through us. By universal thought and emotion, I do not mean now the consciousness of God. I mean that the human mind and the human emotion bears witness to a universal counterpart of these, which in their turn become the structure of the world soul. And man today has almost totally confused the concept of world soul with world spirit. Therefore, in finding his own core of nature, he assumes he has found God. Actually, he has found the focal point of his own psychic integration. This is so great an experience in comparison to his ordinary experience that he may be forgiven if he feels that he is suddenly in the presence of the Absolute. He is not, however, because as long as his experience is involved in mental or emotional factors, it still has to be his own psychic experience. If we study these various conflicts, as we apparently find them in these various questions, they will resolve. There is no essential contradiction. The contradiction arises sometimes from the effort to westernize an Asiatic thought, or create an Oriental equivalent for a Western concept. For instance, early Christian missionaries in China translated the word God for the English Bible into the Chinese word Tao. They felt it was the same thing, because to the Chinese this represented a great divine power. But actually, no Chinese reading the Old Testament or the New Testament with Tao substituted for the term God could possibly get any comprehension of the meaning of Christianity. The terms simply are not so usable. The use of soul as a term in Eastern thought is so very different from its connotation in Western thought that they are actually only confusing issues. I think Madame Blavatsky was aware of that, for she rather well insisted upon the use of the Sanskrit terms to represent those principles which are derived from Hindu philosophy, rather hoping that the disciple would gradually learn the meaning of the term, and in this way differentiate it from the common error of a supposed English equivalent. This we have to admit all the way along. The principle, for instance, of the sattva, which is the Indian Buddhist equivalent, supposedly, of soul. The word sattva has no meaning of soul as we understand it. We say the bodhisattva, or the illumined self. The word sattva as self has no parallel to our general understanding. We think of Gandhi as Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma, great Atma, great self, great soul. But the word Atma and soul, as we understand these terms, are not interchangeable. Consequently, we have to study a little in order to escape the confusion that arises from interpretation or the definite effort to simplify. In the effort to simplify these Asiatic doctrines, words have been used which could not actually express the original meaning. I read the Atma letters at some length and studied them for a number of years, and I do not believe that there are many actual contradictions in these letters in relationship to the basic principles of philosophy or comparative religion. The contradictions lie sometimes in what appears to be a blunt statement, unsupported, and which is very different from our attitudes on this particular theme. But as we study the use of the concept, we come to realize that the only way we can ever understand Oriental philosophy is to first of all graphically create, either on paper or in our minds, the total symbol of their universe, of their whole thinking, of the machinery of cosmos as it arises in their experience. Until we do this, we cannot fit their hierarchies or their orders of life or their evolutionary and involutionary terms into our Darwinian or Spencerian concepts. They just will not fit. But if we once become aware of the total picture, I think we will find that they are consistent with themselves, and that is about all you can ask of any human being. And as I think we've asked about all the time we can ask from you this evening, I think we'll have to suspend operations until a week from tonight. Thank you very much.